Let me take you back to the year 371 BC to the plain of Leuctra, where a specific frequency of terror began to vibrate through the ground, a sound that signaled Judgment Day for an entire civilization. We aren't talking about the disorganized noise of savages or the random violence of a riot. No, this was something far more sinister, something engineered to paralyze the spirit before the first blow was even struck. It was a rhythmic, hypnotic pounding of the earth. Imagine 1,700 heavy bronze shields crashing together in perfect synchronization, amplifying the heartbeat of a war machine. Thousands of feet striking the dry soil in absolute unison, shaking the foundations of the world. And piercing through that heavy bass was the demonic, high-pitched screech of bone flutes designed to put a spell of fear on anyone listening. For 300 years, that auditory weapon broadcast the same message across the nations, a message of inevitable doom. It was psychological warfare at its peak. The programming was simple: the battle is already decided. The system has already won. You are just a walking corpse waiting for the timeline to catch up with your destruction. In living memory, no force had ever stood toe-to-toe with the Spartan phalanx on open ground and lived to tell the tale. This wasn't combat, it was a blood ritual. It was a formalized death sentence executed with mathematical precision. You have to understand, Sparta wasn't just a city-state. It was a principality, a fortress of mindset that had exalted itself above all others. They had created a religion of pure violence, a society convinced that their soldiers had transcended humanity to become living weapons of mass destruction. They believed they were untouchable, protected by a dark destiny. And for 3 centuries, the world bowed down to this lie, because nobody had the spiritual fortitude to challenge the narrative. But watch this: on this specific day, on a patch of dirt in Boeotia that looked like nothing special, the timeline was about to shift. That 300-year-old truth that the elites had pushed on the masses was about to be exposed as a total fabrication. By the time the sun sets and the shadows stretch across the valley, a king who thought he was a god will be bleeding out in the dust like a common man. The most terrifying military-industrial complex of the ancient world is going to be dismantled and utterly humiliated in one single afternoon. And listen to me, the man God used to do it didn't have the numbers. He didn't have superior technology. He didn't have the backing of the global establishment or some secret society handshake. His name was Epaminondas of Thebes, and he walked onto that field with the only weapon the enemy couldn't account for: a mind that refused to accept their reality. He carried the one advantage Sparta was too arrogant to defend against. He had the ability to see past the illusion. While every other general in Greece looked at that Spartan line and saw an invincible wall of red cloaks and hammered bronze trembling in fear at the projection of power, he saw something else entirely. Epaminondas looked at that same wall and saw a glitch in the matrix. He saw a pattern, a habit, a deep-seated structural flaw that had been hiding in plain sight for generations. It wasn't protected by brilliant strategy, it was protected by the spirit of fear that kept everyone else from looking too closely at the enemy's armor. He realized the Spartan phalanx wasn't divine judgment, it was just a man-made system. And hear me now, every system, no matter how powerful it looks, has a breaking point. It has a thermal exhaust port. He just needed the audacity to reach out and press the button that would bring the whole house of cards crashing down. While the rest of the leadership class in Greece was ready to kneel and surrender rather than face the beast on open terrain, this man downloaded a strategy so unorthodox, so outside the box, that his own officers thought he had lost his mind. So we aren't just asking if an underdog can win a fight. The question cuts to the core of our reality. How did one individual weaponize faith, desperation, and pure tactical rebellion into a spear sharp enough to shatter a mythology that had held an entire civilization in a state of terror for centuries? How did he engineer a confrontation so catastrophic for the establishment that the Spartans who actually survived the day wished they had died with their king rather than face the shame of their broken paradigm? And what happens to a global superpower that has staked its entire identity on being invincible the moment the world watches their warriors break, bleed, and run like frightened children? Stick with me, because we are about to dissect the exact moment a mortal man killed a false god. Before we go any deeper into this revelation, I want you to sound off in the comments. Tell me what city and nation you are representing right now in 2026. If you are hungry for more truth like this, make sure you are subscribed to help us build this community. You are tuned in to the ultimate source for dark history and hidden truth. Now understand the atmosphere. Every soul standing on that plane thought they already knew the ending. The script had been written 100 times before, and the elites expected it to play out exactly as planned. On one side you had Thebes and its partners, a coalition of the awakened who had just torn themselves free from the chains of Spartan domination. On the other side stood the undisputed masters of organized death, the enforcers of the old world order. Sparta didn't hold back. They brought the full weight of their military apparatus. Their king Cleombrotus was there. Hundreds of Spartiates, the purebloods, the elite class, raised from birth for this exact moment of dominance. Along with them were thousands of allied heavy infantry, the useful idiots of the empire. And backing all that physical might was the crushing psychological weight of 300 years of unbroken supremacy. If you had interviewed anyone in Greece that morning about the outcome, they would have given you the same programmed answer without a second thought. They would tell you this wasn't going to be a contest. It was going to be a public execution, a demonstration of power to remind the serfs who was in charge. To truly understand why their arrogance was so absolute, you have to look past the myths and examine the mechanics of their control grid. Greek warfare in this era revolved around one central technology, the hoplite phalanx. Picture rows of armored men, each one carrying a massive round shield strapped to his left arm and a long spear in his right. They were packed in tight, condensed like a brick wall, so close that your shield wasn't just for your own protection. Front ranks became a moving barricade of wood and metal, while the ranks behind them leaned in and driving the whole mass forward with the sheer physical weight of the collective. This style of war had no place for individual heroes or independent thinkers. It rewarded total submission to the group, cohesion, timing, nerve. As long as the wall held together, you got to go home. If that wall cracked, you were trampled into the dust. Every major city in Greece had bought into this system and could assemble some version of it. Athens drilled it, Corinth fielded it, Argos fought with it. They were all playing the same game. But Sparta, they perfected the programming. Spartan boys were snatched from their homes as children and fed into the agoge, a brutal indoctrination camp designed not to educate but to strip away their humanity, removing everything soft and rebuilding them into functioning cogs of a war machine. They were taught to march in lockstep before they even learned to read. By the time a Spartan male took his place in the phalanx, he wasn't just a soldier standing in a line. He was a gear in a demonic engine that had one purpose and executed it without mercy, advance, compress, and utterly destroy whatever dared to stand in its path. But here is the secret: every engine built by man has a design flaw, and the phalanx had a critical error baked right into its DNA. That heavy shield, locked onto the left arm, left the right side of every soldier's body feeling exposed and naked. It was a primal instinct, something you couldn't train out of the human psyche. Every man in the line unconsciously pressed a little closer to the shield of the man on his right, desperately seeking cover that wasn't quite there. The man beside him did the same thing. And the next man. Multiply that tiny flinch of fear across a line of 1,000 men, and the cumulative effect became enormous. As the phalanx marched forward, the entire formation would drift to the right like a ship being pulled off course by an invisible dark current. Greek generals had been trying to cope with this drift for generations. Some tried to anchor their vulnerable flank against a hill or a river to stop the bleeding. Others placed their most hardened veterans on the side, most likely to buckle under pressure. But most commanders treated it like a natural disaster, something inevitable. They thought you couldn't stop it. You just planned around it and prayed the damage was manageable. But Sparta didn't just manage the drift, they weaponized it. Instead of fighting that natural pull to the right, they built their entire doctrine of dominance around that very flaw. The Spartan king always positioned himself on the far right of the formation, exactly where the drift would push the hardest and the fastest, riding the wave of that momentum. Surrounding him were his royal bodyguards and the most seasoned killers in the army. So, the tip of the spear, already engineered by physics to strike first and deepest, was also loaded with the most dangerous psychopaths on the field. Every time the line moved forward, that right wing transformed into a battering ram, swinging into the enemy's left flank with devastating, almost mechanical precision, crushing everything in its way. And the results were horrifyingly consistent. Battle after battle, year after year, the same script played out just like the controllers intended. The Spartan right, stacked with elite warriors, would slam into the opposing left wing, which was almost never where the enemy placed their best troops. Those men were usually on their own right flank, distracted by fighting the weaker Spartan allies in a more balanced contest. So, the decisive collision always happened exactly where Sparta was the strongest and the enemy was the weakest. It was a mismatch by design. The opposing left would buckle and then it would shatter completely. Then the Spartans would wheel inward, rolling down the exposed side of the enemy line like a prison door swinging shut. It became legend, it became the expectation, it became a kind of spiritual gravity that no one in Greece seemed able to escape. And that was the nightmare staring Epaminondas in the face at Leuctra. The terrain offered absolutely nothing to hide behind. No gorge, no fortress wall, no narrow pass that could neutralize the Spartan discipline. He was out in the open. If both armies simply lined up in the traditional way and walked into each other, Sparta would execute the same playbook it had been running for a century to keep the world under its heel. Their right wing, packed with Cleombrotus and his royal guard, would carve through the Theban left like a hot blade through linen. And after that, the rest would just be cleanup. Epaminondas saw all of this with a prophetic clarity that bordered on obsession. Epaminondas wasn't the type of general who needed to scream to be heard or put on a theatrical show to demand respect. Back in Thebes, people spoke of him like he was a rare anomaly, a man who was just as comfortable breaking down complex philosophy as he was drilling infantry in the mud. He was a student of warfare, sure, but he dissected it with the cold precision of a surgeon peeling back layers of human anatomy to find the truth underneath. He had spent years analyzing the Spartan machine, watching them operate from the shadows. He downloaded their history, memorized their rituals, and studied that terrifying aura of invincibility that seemed to freeze every opposing army before they even stepped onto the grass. But while the rest of the world looked at Sparta and saw an unstoppable force of nature, Epaminondas saw something else entirely. He saw a habit. He realized the Spartans never bothered to update their software, because quite frankly, they never had to. Being on top for so long had calcified their lethal tactics into predictable rituals. And in the high-stakes game of war, a ritual, no matter how deadly, is just a pattern waiting to be exploited by someone paying attention. However, on that specific morning, the biggest danger to his master plan wasn't the sea of red cloaks standing across the field. The real threat was breathing down his neck right there in his own ranks. The Boeotian allies Thebes had dragged into this confrontation were barely keeping it together. Most of them had seen what happens when you cross Sparta, watching other cities get ground into absolute dust by those phalanxes, and they had zero appetite for being the next tragedy. Fear was moving through the camp like a toxic poison, paralyzing the spirit of the men. You could hear the murmurs everywhere. Maybe we should fall back to better ground. Maybe we should cut a deal. There were even rumors that some allied squads were packing their bags, preparing to ghost the battlefield entirely before a single spear was even thrown. Epaminondas was being crushed in a vice from two directions at once. In front of him stood the most efficient, cold-blooded killing machine the ancient world had ever produced. And behind him, an army that was dissolving, crumbling under the sheer weight of its own anxiety. If his coalition shattered before the fight even started, Sparta wouldn't even need to unsheathe a sword to claim the victory. Here was the trap if he lined his men up in the standard formation. A long, even line, matching their long, even line, he would simply be feeding Theban bodies into a meat grinder that had been chewing up and digesting Greek armies for 300 years. He had to break the pattern. It wasn't just about breaking the Spartan formation. He had to dismantle the story Sparta had told about itself. He had to shatter the myth that made brave armies surrender before the first blow actually landed. He started with the one glitch in the system that everyone acknowledged, but nobody had the nerve to exploit the drift. See if Sparta's line always pulled to the right, and if the king always commanded that right wing, then the geometry of every battle was predetermined. That meant the hottest, most violent point of contact was always going to be the exact same corner of the field. And for generations, every opposing general had responded the same way, like they were following a script. The conventional wisdom was simple. Keep your elite troops far away from that kill zone. Why sacrifice your finest men against the strongest section of the Spartan army? You put them somewhere safer. You use them to beat up on weaker opponents. It was logical. It was sensible. And that safe, logical thinking is exactly why Sparta kept winning championships. Epaminondas decided to flip the board and invert the logic entirely. Instead of spreading his strength evenly across the line like a thin coat of paint, he imagined concentrating almost all his chips onto a single point. He wasn't going for the standard 12 ranks deep. He was going for something grotesquely thicker. He built a column so dense, so incredibly heavy, that when it hit, it would generate a force the Spartan right wing was never designed to absorb. Instead of building a wall to hold them back, he was building a fist to smash them open. And he would aim that fist directly at the throat of the Spartan army king Cleombrotus and his royal guard. But the price tag for this radical idea was immediate and brutal. To build that kind of mass on his left wing, he had to hollow out the rest of his line. His center would be paper thin. His right flank would be practically skeletal. If those sections tried to fight a conventional phalanx engagement, they would be overwhelmed and wiped out in minutes. This was not a balanced battle plan, it was a controlled demolition. Everything hinged on one massive strike landing, home before the rest of the structure collapsed around them. As Epaminondas studied the ground, at Leuctra, he layered another violation of convention onto his design. He did not want both battle lines to crash together simultaneously the way every Greek battle had worked for centuries. He wanted a staggered impact. That massively reinforced Theban left would launch forward fast and hit first, driving into the Spartan right before the rest of the field had even made contact. Meanwhile, his weakened center and right would advance in slow motion, deliberately lagging behind, buying precious time rather than seeking a collision. Instead of one uniform clash stretching across the entire plain, there would be a single concentrated explosion on one flank, while the rest of the battle still hung in the air. To any experienced Greek officer, this looked like absolute insanity. Think about it. If your center and right are still approaching, while your left is already locked in combat, the enemy could exploit those gaps. They could wheel around your flanks and circle you. They could collapse your thin sections before your main attack accomplished anything. And if your reinforced left failed to break through, you had absolutely nothing left to fall back on. The whole army would unravel in an instant. Epaminondas knew every one of those risks. He also knew that playing by the established rules guaranteed defeat. The only way to beat a system that ran on predictable inputs was to feed it something it had never processed before. For the Spartan machine, that something was total, overwhelming force concentrated on the one point they considered impenetrable. His officers pushed back hard. His allied commanders were terrified, demanding reassurance. They wanted to hear about numerical advantages, hidden reserves, some concrete edge that would tilt the odds. But the numbers offered no comfort. The two armies were roughly matched in total strength, and by some estimates, Sparta may have even held a slight advantage in manpower. What Epaminondas possessed was not a bigger army. It was a willingness to bend the geometry of battle in a way no one had ever attempted against the Spartan Empire, explaining that to terrified men on the eve of combat was a different kind of war entirely. He began reshaping the formation. On the left, he pulled together the absolute best Thebes had to offer, the city's finest hoplites, and at the tip of that mass, the unit that would carve its name into history before the day was over, the Sacred Band. He stacked rank behind rank behind rank until the column reached a depth that would have looked absurd to any conventional tactician. Behind the Sacred Band, wave after wave of Theban citizens and allied fighters were compressed into a battering mass pointed at a single target. This was no longer just a wing of an army. It was a siege weapon in human form designed to punch through one specific section of the enemy line and kill the man standing at its center. The center and right, meanwhile, were stretched thin and given a task that went against every fiber of their training. They were not there to win. They were there to survive just long enough for the left to finish the job. From the Spartan side of the field, this strange arrangement drew contempt more than concern. The Spartans were accustomed to enemies imitating their methods, not reinventing them. They noticed the heavy Theban left and likely dismissed it as a nervous attempt to shore up a vulnerable flank. Their answer would be the same answer it had always been. Cleombrotus and his guard would do what Spartan kings had done for generations. They would drive forward, break whatever stood in front of them, and add another line to the long record of Spartan dominance. But Epaminondas had one more card to play before the infantry collided. He pushed his cavalry forward closer to the front lines than convention allowed. Theban horsemen were among the best in Greece, and he intended to use them not as a sideshow but as a chaotic, disruptive force. If he could scatter the Spartan cavalry and throw the front ranks of the Spartan phalanx into momentary chaos, even a few minutes of confusion would be enough. In a battle decided by tight formations, a brief window of disorder could create fractures that would never exist under normal conditions. Then came the order that must have felt like treason to the men who received it. After a lifetime of watching Sparta's right wing obliterate enemy flanks, every officer in the Theban army expected Epaminondas to reinforce his own right wing to compensate. Match strength against strength. Shore up the side that would face the weakest Spartan pressure so it could at least hold. Instead, Epaminondas told them to weaken the right even further. The strategy for the Theban right wing defied every convention of ancient warfare. They were instructed not to engage, but to actively recoil. It was a calculated refusal to meet the Spartan gaze, a tactical withdrawal, designed to surrender territory in exchange for something far more valuable. The center of the line was tasked with a similar deception, drifting forward like a phantom limb, threatening a collision it had no intention of delivering. The entire army, save for the colossal monstrosity on the left, was operating as a massive decoy, a flexible screen designed to absorb pressure and burn the clock without ever committing to the slaughter. You have to pause and visualize the expressions on the faces of the soldiers receiving these commands, men bred for the singular purpose of frontal assault. These were hardened veterans who had spent decades programming their muscle memory to plant their feet, lock shields, and grind the enemy into dust, now being ordered to violate their own instincts. They were told to retreat without taking a hit, to delay without engaging, to become like smoke that the enemy could reach for but never grasp. To the uninitiated, it looked like cowardice masquerading as a battle plan. But to those who understood the stakes, it sounded like a suicide pact signed in blood. If the Spartan war machine punched through those thinned-out sectors before the heavy hitters on the left could deliver the death blow, the Theban army wouldn't just be defeated. It would be bisected and butchered in the open. Stop and realize the sheer psychological weight required to hold the line under that kind of existential threat. Epaminondas wasn't merely gambling with his own mortality. He was pushing all the chips to the center of the table, the survival of Thebes, the liberation of Boeotia, and the entire geopolitical architecture of Greece, betting it all on a formation that every military expert of the day considered absolute lunacy. If this unorthodox attack crumbled, his city wouldn't just lose a legion of men. It would be stripped of its sovereignty, its pride, and likely its very walls would be torn down stone by stone. Yet in the face of total annihilation, he stayed the course. Before we witness the moment of impact that changed the world, I need to speak directly to the remnant listening right now. If you are still locked in, still vibrating with this narrative, you are not a casual tourist. You understand that history isn't just a dusty timeline of dates. It is the autopsy of decisions made in the crucible of impossible pressure. We have built a sanctuary for minds that operate on this frequency. It is called the lineage, our inner circle of truth seekers. When you step into this arena, you aren't just tossing a coin to a creator. You are taking a stand with a core community of critical thinkers who refuse to let these deep, hidden truths vanish into the ether. Members of the lineage gain priority access to uncensored documentaries and join a brotherhood that refuses to accept the shallow mainstream narrative. If that resonates with your spirit, if you hunger to know how power truly moves in the shadows, then it is time to align yourself with us. Now let us return to the killing fields of Leuctra. The time for debate had expired. The trap was set and the pieces were moving on the board. On the Theban left, a nightmare was taking shape, a monstrous column stacked 50 ranks deep, a forest of spear points aimed like a ballistic missile at the heart of the Spartan leadership. The center and the right, hollowed out and trembling under the burden of their deception, prepared for a psychological warfare no Greek army had ever endured. A battle where survival depended on suppressing the warrior's urge to strike back. Across the divide, Cleombrotus tightened his grip on his shield, preparing his men for the standard playbook, completely blind to the fact that his enemy had rewritten the rules of the game specifically to exploit Spartan arrogance. Epaminondas made one final grim walk along his front line, speaking in low, steel-hard tones to the officers tasked with the most perilous duties. He didn't offer them the false comfort of safety. He offered them only a vision if they could hold their nerve and execute the timing with surgical precision. This single afternoon would shatter the myth of invincibility that had shackled Greece for longer than any living soul could recall. Then he took his position on the left, embedding himself among the men designated for the day's most brutal butchery. Their objective was singular, terrifying, and absolute. They were to march directly into the strongest teeth of the Spartan defense, reach the king, and physically dismantle the idea that Sparta could not be broken. The bone flutes began to wail. Dust rose like smoke from the abyss. The giants began to move. In that suspended, breathless second, before the charge, before reality snapped, Epaminondas issued the command that must have sent a shiver of ice through the veins of half his legion. The right wing was to recede. The center was to stall. But the Theban left, packed 50 men deep and burning with a fire hotter than discipline, was to march straight down the throat of the Spartan king without pausing for breath. They were not going to maneuver around the kill zone. They were going to walk directly into the furnace. As the gap closed and the rhythmic thunder of the advance swelled into a roar that no man could ignore, a terrifying realization hit every soldier on the field simultaneously. This was no longer a standard military engagement. This was a targeted assassination attempt, a concentrated strike designed to rip the heart out of Spartan power while the world watched. The coming collision would decide whether Epaminondas was a visionary who had cracked the code of war, or a madman who had just signed the death warrant for everything he loved. But the first blow at Leuctra wasn't steel on bronze. It was the thunder of hooves. The Theban cavalry surged forward in a disciplined, kinetic wave, kicking up a blinding curtain of grit that choked the plain. These riders were elite operators sharpened by years of deliberate investment and drill. The Spartan horsemen, by comparison, were a joke, an afterthought, a neglected limb of a military body that never respected the cavalry enough to train it. When these two forces crashed into each other, there was no glory in it. It was a violent, ugly tangle of animal muscle and panicked men, and it concluded exactly as Epaminondas had calculated. The Spartan riders were blasted backwards, stumbling in a chaotic retreat directly into the path of their own advancing infantry. Panicked horses wheeled around, crashing into the front ranks of the renowned Spartan phalanx. Shields clashed against teammates. The rhythmic, hypnotic cadence of the march was shattered for precious seconds as hoplites scrambled to dodge thrashing beasts. Cleombrotus watched the disorder ripple through his vanguard and waited for the reset. They would recover. They always did. But he didn't realize that those few seconds of chaos were not a mistake. They were a purchase. Time had been bought, and the price would be the total destruction of Sparta. Because while the Spartan front was still struggling to find its footing, the true weapon arrived. At the tip of the spear of the Theban column stood a unit that would carve its name into eternity before the sun set the sacred band. 300 elite warriors, 30 files of 10 men. They were positioned at the piercing point of the deepest formation anyone had ever witnessed. But what separated the Sacred Band from every other Special Forces unit in history was not their gear, their drill, or their head count. It was the man standing next to them. Each soldier in the Sacred Band was fighting beside his lover. The ancient records don't try to sanitize this or whisper about it. The unit was engineered on romantic bonds between men, and the logic behind that design was as cold hard and practical as a blade. A soldier might leave a friend behind to save his own skin. He might break under the terror of death and choose survival over duty. But would he turn and flee, knowing that the love of his life was standing in the front rank, exposed, about to be butchered alone? Would he drop his shield and run while the person who held his soul was being trampled into the bloody mud just 3 feet away? The Thebans bet the entire kingdom on the answer being no, and that wager turned the Sacred Band into a force of nature that Spartan training could never replicate. Spartan discipline was institutional, beaten into children, hardened by the state. But the cohesion of the Sacred Band was personal, primal. Each pair of fighters formed a closed circuit of absolute devotion. Each file of 10 was a web of these bonds layered and interlocked into an unbreakable chain. This wasn't just a military formation. It was a structure held together by the most potent adhesive in the human experience, the absolute refusal to let someone you love die while you still have breath in your lungs. And behind the emotional wall of the sacred band rose the true horror of Epaminondas' invention, pure overwhelming mass. A standard Greek phalanx was a wall 8 to 12 ranks deep. 12 was considered heavy duty, enough weight to hold the line. Epaminondas had mutated his left wing into a monstrosity of roughly 50 ranks. 50 rows of armored killers' shields, pressed into the backs of their brothers' spears, angled over shoulders, all compressed into a single dense battering ram aimed at one specific point in the line. Visualize this moment. You need to lock in and picture yourself standing right there in the vanguard, the very front line of the formation. Staring you down are the supposed masters of war, the deadliest killers the ancient world had ever manufactured. But look behind you. There are 49 rows of your brothers, a massive wall of humanity, driving forward with the undeniable momentum of a landslide. You have zero options. You cannot stop. You cannot take a single step backward. Even if every nerve in your body is screaming in terror, retreat is physically impossible because of the sheer crushing weight of the men at your back. You are no longer just a man, you have become a human projectile. The army behind you is the gunpowder, and the target is nothing less than the king of Sparta himself. Across that killing field, the Spartan line still looked absolutely magnificent, like an untouchable monument to power. You see the crimson cloaks snapping in the wind, the bronze armor blinding in the sunlight, and those bone flutes playing that same cold, terrifying melody they have used to signal death for generations. King Cleombrotus had stood on battlefields just like this 1,000 times before. He felt that familiar pull, the drift that happens in phalanx warfare, the steady creep to the right and the gradual acceleration before the violence begins. To him, everything about this moment felt like a rerun. It was business as usual for the establishment. He fully expected to meet the Theban left flank exactly the way Spartan kings had always dealt with their enemies, with total dominance. The plan was always the same. Absorb the shock, hold the line, and then grind them down until their spirit broke. But something in the sacred geometry of this battle was wrong. The Theban center and right wing were not advancing with intent. They seemed to be hanging back, hovering in the air like a storm cloud that refuses to break, as if the men in those sectors had lost their courage. To the arrogant Spartan eye, it looked like weakness. It looked like an army crumbling before the fight even started. But in reality, it was the jaws of the trap snapping shut. The real threat wasn't the hesitant center. It was that massive, anomalous column bearing down on Cleombrotus' flank, deeper, heavier, and more dense than anything a Spartan commander had ever had to calculate in his nightmares. The final seconds before the collision are always the ones that stretch out into eternity. You are close enough now to read the eyes of the man who intends to end your life. Close enough to see the white knuckles gripping the spear shaft, preparing to strike. You are close enough to hear individual voices cutting through the roar of the crowd. The front ranks shift gears, breaking into a jog. It's not quite a sprint, but it is definitely faster than a walk. It is the pace of inevitable judgment. The atmosphere becomes toxic with the shrieking of flutes, the barking of officers, and the dull, rhythmic percussion of thousands of feet hammering the dry earth in near-perfect unison. And then the timelines converged. The first heartbeat of combat was nothing but a wall of spear points. Savage jabs aimed right over the rim of the shields, hunting for throats, searching for that soft vulnerability under the arm, looking for any exposed flesh to tear apart. Some spears simply shattered on impact. Others bent and jammed together in the claustrophobic space between these two walls of men. The fighters in the second rank were leaning their heavy weapons over the shoulders of the front line, stabbing blindly, just thrusting at anything that moved in the kill zone. This was the brutal close-quarters reality of hoplite warfare. Forget the movies. This wasn't a duel. This was a grinding industrial exchange of stabs and shoves where the objective was terrifyingly simple. Keep your wall solid, shatter theirs. But at Leuctra, the normal rhythm of that exchange only lasted for a few fleeting moments before something far more horrifying took over the narrative: the crush. We are talking about 50 solid rows of humanity surging forward like a tidal wave. The men in the back, they are blind to the carnage up front. They just hear the call to advance and they push with everything they have. The middle ranks feel the squeeze tightening the pressure building, but they are flying blind too. But the front ranks, they felt everything. They were caught in a vice between the Spartan shields ahead and the irresistible mass of their own army behind them. There was no room left for technique or fancy footwork. There was no space for skill. It was purely force meeting force, and one side had brought nearly 4 times the depth to the fight. The Spartan right wing held on. For a breath, maybe 2. The Spartan hoplites locked their shields, dug their heels into the shifting sand, and leaned into that collision with every ounce of discipline their brutal training had given them. But here is the truth. Physics does not care about your reputation. Every man in that Spartan front rank wasn't just fighting the soldier in front of him. He was trying to absorb the kinetic momentum of 50 rows of human weight. That is a level of pressure you cannot match with mere courage or bravado. It was a force that compressed your chest against your own shield until your lungs could no longer expand to take a breath. Cleombrotus felt the line shudder. The front ranks of his elite wing began to lose ground, not in big dramatic steps, but in agonizing inches. Small grinding concessions of territory that added up with terrifying speed. The Spartan line wasn't just collapsing, it was being metabolized. It was being swallowed whole. For every half step, a Spartan was forced backward, a Theban was there to fill the void. The formation that had held all of Greece in a state of terror for 3 centuries began to bend inward, bowing like a support beam, taking on more load than it was ever engineered to carry. And inside that buckling section, a private claustrophobic nightmare was unfolding for everyone involved. Men in the 2nd and 3rd ranks found themselves compressed between their own brothers and the enemy wall, until they were pinned so tight they couldn't even move their arms. Shields were jammed at awkward angles, spears were locked together in useless tangled knots. The pressure from the rear kept building as the back ranks mindlessly pushed forward, completely unaware of the hellscape they were feeding their comrades into. Ribs were flexing and cracking against the inside of bronze breastplates. Some men pinned perfectly upright began gasping for air, suffocating even though no blade had actually touched them. At the tip of the spear, the sacred band refused to yield a single inch. For these men, this fight carried a spiritual weight that went way beyond tactics. They had grown up under the dark shadow of Spartan supremacy. Every Greek child alive had been indoctrinated with stories of Thermopylae of Plataea, of the 100 smaller battles where Spartan discipline crushed every army foolish enough to stand in its path. If the sacred band broke now, those myths would survive for another generation. But if they held the line, they would be the authors of a new history. They would rewrite the code of their civilization. Behind them, voice after voice screamed the same word like a mantra: push, push. The Theban column transformed into a living siege engine. This was the strategy that changed everything. That absurd depth which the so-called experts of the day would have laughed at was being transmuted into pure crushing physical advantage. Instead of distributing force across a long, thin line, Epaminondas had compressed it all into a single singularity. And that focal point was driving into the Spartan right wing like a railroad spike into soft wood. Not because the Spartans lacked guts, not because their training failed them. It happened because the human body has a structural breaking point. And Epaminondas had designed a formation whose entire purpose was to locate that breaking point and smash right through it. The dust thickened until the sun was just a dull, bloody smear overhead. Blood ran down the faces of the shields and pooled in the trampled sand below. Spears cracked and splintered into jagged shivs. Men shrieked as iron points found soft flesh punching through groins, faces, and the delicate tissue right above the collarbone. But the dead did not fall. There was simply no room for them to go down. The bodies stayed upright, pinned between the living, held in place by the same crushing pressure that had killed them. Some men suffocated while standing on their feet, their final breaths crushed out of them by the weight of their own comrades pressing forward, and somewhere in that grinding chaos, King Cleombrotus was struck. Now, the ancient sources differ on the specifics. Maybe it was a spear thrust, maybe a sword blow. The exact second is lost to history, but they all converge on the outcome. The king of Sparta, fighting in the forward ranks of his right wing as tradition demanded, was wounded so severely that he could no longer stand up or command his army. His personal guard closed around him instantly, forming a desperate pocket of shields, trying to keep the Theban spear points away from his dying body. In the suffocating press of the melee, the chain of command dissolved into pure noise. The front rank lost any clear boundary between offense and defense. Men who had been trained since boyhood to hold formation and push forward were now fighting with one frantic, singular purpose. Do not let the king's body fall into enemy hands. For Sparta, this was not simply the loss of a general. It was a direct attack on the foundational belief system of their entire civilization. The king was supposed to be the living proof that Sparta did not lose in open combat. He was the physical embodiment of a 300-year-old promise of invincibility. When the men around him saw the blood running from his body, when they watched him sag and buckle under the weight, something deeper than a battle line began to fracture in their minds. The royal guard started pulling back, dragging the king's body with them. That small rearward motion rippled outward like a crack in a pane of glass. The files behind them sensed the movement and adjusted. A controlled step became a short retreat, and the beginning of the end was undeniable. You have to understand the sheer magnitude of this moment. The Thebans sensed the pressure giving way, and they didn't just advance, they flooded into that gap with the force of a tidal wave. They drove those spears home, putting every ounce of shoulder muscle and generational trauma into the thrust. This wasn't just a tactical maneuver, it was the explosive release of a people who had been beaten down, mocked and told for decades that they were destined to lose, only to suddenly realize they were the ones holding the hammer. What took place in the next few minutes would have been considered absolute science fiction in any Greek city-state just an hour prior. The standard operating procedure, hold the line lock, the shields stabilized the formation completely disintegrated. The Spartan elite, the ones closest to the king, stopped fighting the enemy and started fighting the chaos, abandoning the very formations that made them legendary. In a split second, the objective shifted. Victory was no longer the goal. Winning was irrelevant. The entire mission parameters changed to a single desperate objective: recover the royal body. That corpse became the center of the universe. These were soldiers who had been drilled from birth to lock shields and create an impenetrable wall of bronze. Instead, they turned inward, violating every protocol of phalanx warfare. They clustered around Cleombrotus, frantically trying to lift him, shield him from the carnage, and pass him back through the ranks. Some of them literally turned their backs on the Theban spears just to get a hand on their fallen king. Epaminondas was watching all of this from the thick of his own left wing. For him, this wasn't chaos. It was validation. This was the exact structural failure he had engineered the entire battle to create. He saw the fracture in the Spartan discipline, and he knew the wall was finally open. The invincible machine was broken. The sacred band and the heavy infantry behind them didn't hesitate. They poured into that breach like floodwaters bursting through a collapsed levee. Their spears weren't meeting shields anymore. They were finding the exposed backs of men who had foolishly turned around to play bodyguard. It was a slaughter. They drove their iron into unguarded flanks and exposed throats, tearing apart the gaps left by soldiers who had abandoned their posts in the shield wall. The evacuation of King Cleombrotus turned into a bloody, chaotic knot of tangled limbs and corpses right at the heart of a disintegrating right wing. A few Spartans managed to drag the king's body out of the meat grinder, but plenty of others were cut down right where they stood, butchered in the act of trying to be heroes. The intel started traveling down the Spartan line in fragmented, panicked whispers, and every version of the story was more catastrophic than the last. The fog of war set in heavy. Some men heard the king was dead on the spot, others heard he was just wounded. Some simply saw the royal standard dip into the dust, and knowing Spartan history assumed the absolute worst scenario had just played out. Honestly, it didn't matter which version of the truth hit them. The psychological fallout was identical. For the first time in living memory, Spartan soldiers were fighting under the crushing weight of a new reality. Their king might be dead, and their supposedly godlike right wing was being shoved backward. The myth of invincibility wasn't just cracking, it was shattering in real time. Over on the Spartan left and center, the allied troops started to get shaky. You have to remember, these weren't the hardcore Spartiates. These were the second stringers, the allies, the guys who didn't grow up in the Agoge. These were men from vassal cities that marched under Sparta's banner because they had to, not because they wanted to. Some were there by choice, sure, but most were there by compulsion. Their entire confidence system was built on a single fragile assumption. They believed no. They banked their lives on the idea that the Spartan elite on the right wing would do what they always did. Crush the enemy, shatter the line at the critical point, but now they looked over at that legendary right wing and saw nothing but dust, confusion, and the undeniable sight of Spartans moving backward. Meanwhile, the Theban center and right were playing their part with absolute surgical precision. They weren't trying to be heroes. They weren't trying to win their sector. They were executing a perfect refused flank, yielding ground in slow, deliberate steps. They kept the Spartan allies tied up and busy without ever committing to the kind of full-scale collision that would have revealed how thin their own ranks actually were. They bent, but they refused to snap. They survived minute by excruciating minute, buying just enough time for the hammer blow on the left to finish its demolition job. It was a masterclass in patience. If you could pull back and view this battlefield from a drone's perspective hovering above the dust clouds, you would see the geometry of the fight completely transform. It was shifting into something unrecognizable. The Spartan right, which was supposed to be the spear tip of a glorious advance, looked like a swollen, disorganized mess being bulldozed backward. The deep, heavy column of the Theban left was carving into it like a steel wedge splitting a piece of dry timber. The center of the Spartan line started to twist and warp. Gaps were opening up between the units. That clean, disciplined, machine-like formation that had been the signature of Spartan dominance for 3 centuries was deforming right before their eyes, bending and tearing under a specific type of pressure it was never designed to handle. The body count was skyrocketing around the spot where Cleombrotus had gone down. It was becoming a kill zone. Now, the history books struggle with the details here. Some accounts say his body was left in the dirt during the worst of the panic and only recovered later under a truce. Others claim he was carried off still breathing only to die a short time later. But for the grunts on the ground, still holding a spear, the distinction was meaningless. The king was gone. Whether his heart had stopped beating or was fading out somewhere behind the lines, his presence on the field had evaporated. The living symbol around which the entire Spartan identity revolved had been broken in full view of both armies. Once that reality sank in, the battle stopped being a contest of tactics and formations. It morphed into something much darker. It became a total collapse of faith. On the flanks, the Allied troops began peeling away. At first, some just stepped back in a measured retreat trying to look professional. But others didn't bother with appearances, they turned and ran outright. They did the math: instantly stay next to a crumbling wing and you get flanked, surrounded, and butchered. These guys didn't sign up to die for a myth that was bleeding out in the mud. They weren't Spartiates, they didn't share the cult mentality. And the moment they saw the cult start to die, they made the decision to live. The phalanx started coming apart in chunks. Some Spartan units fought on in grim, isolated clusters, totally cut off, outnumbered, refusing to give an inch even as they were being dismantled. Others tried to pull back with some semblance of order, stepping backward in tight groups, keeping their shields facing the enemy. But let's be real, once unit cohesion is gone, discipline becomes a very lonely, very dangerous act. The Theban spears were finding every gap, every exposed back, every man who hesitated between fighting and running. And then, amidst the smoke and the screaming and the absolute chaos, something happened that would have been inconceivable to any Spartan alive when the sun came up that morning. Some of them dropped their shields and ran. Let that sink in for a second. Really let it land. The entire Spartan worldview was forged around a single, non-negotiable command drilled into every boy from the day he entered the agoge. Come back with your shield, or come back dead on it. To drop your shield was the ultimate sin. It was a confession that you had deserted your brothers to save your own skin. You might survive the battle physically, but socially. You were a dead man walking. You would return home as a trembler, a living ghost stripped of all honor, branded as a coward for the rest of your miserable life. And yet right here on this Boeotian plain, under the unbearable pressure of the Theban onslaught and the sight of their king's blood in the dust, a handful of Spartans looked at that shame and chose it over certain death. It wasn't a total rout, but the psychological dam had broken. Now many Spartans fought with suicidal stubbornness, dying right where they stood, rather than take a single step backward. Others managed a withdrawal that saved a shred of dignity. But none of that mattered once the story got out. The image that was about to go viral across the ancient world was simple and absolutely annihilating. Spartan hoplites in a fair fight on open ground with their king present and their formation perfect at the start had been broken. They weren't tricked in some ambush. They weren't outmaneuvered at sea. They were beaten face-to-face, man-to-man, in broad daylight, in exactly the kind of grinded-out fight they had spent 300 years, convincing the world they could never lose. Epaminondas didn't order a reckless pursuit. He wasn't reckless. He was calculating. He had achieved what no living general thought was possible. He had reached into the chest of the Spartan army and ripped its heart out. But he knew the battle itself was just the first incision. What he did next would decide whether this went down in history as just a bad afternoon for Sparta or the beginning of their permanent irreversible slide from the summit of power. Before we move into the next phase of this collapse, I want to pull you out of the dust and chaos for a second to talk about something we don't discuss enough on this platform, the intel, the research. The narrative you are hearing right now wasn't pulled out of thin air. It was built on a primary backbone, a single book that goes incredibly deep into Leuctra, Sparta, and Thebes with unforgiving, gritty detail. That exact book, the one that shaped today's script, is sitting right now on the product shelf on your screen. This isn't just some dry history textbook, it is a brutal archive of how myths are constructed and how they are demolished. If you want to truly understand the mechanics of what happened here, you need this in your library. And there is more waiting on that shelf. When you crack it open, you aren't just looking at one title. You are stepping into a curated vault of dark memorabilia tied to this world-immersive relics and grim artifacts that match the heavy atmosphere of stories like this one. I'm not going to spoil everything that's in there, because the inventory shifts, but if you dig through it, you will find them alongside our official channel collection of essential dark history books. Go ahead and open the shop panel, browse the collection while I keep talking and turn your viewing experience into something tangible you can actually hold in your hands. Back on the field, the dust begins to settle. The roar of clashing lines fades into the cries of the wounded and the heavy silence of the dead. The Theban warriors are holding their ground boots sinking deep into the mud, and the blood looking out over the absolute wreckage of two colliding empires. They did not just win a fight, they paid a heavy toll to flip the script on history. But here is the reality check: they are still standing on their feet, while the so-called invincible machine that was sent to wipe them out is broken on the floor. The Spartans who survived are huddled up in shell-shocked little groups doing a head count and realizing the math does not look good. They are staring at that patch of dirt where their king got taken out of the game. They know deep in their gut that if they even make it back to the crib, the old world is dead. It is a new timeline now. That spiritual hedge, that aura of invincibility that protected Sparta better than any concrete wall or missile defense system, has been popped right in front of witnesses. The whole neighborhood, every city in Greece, is about to hear the news. Every puppet state is running the numbers again. Every partner is looking for the exit door. Epaminondas is facing a decision right now that is going to define the power dynamics for the next generation. He could go old school on them. He could close the nets around the survivors and run up the score with a massacre before the sun goes down. He could maximize the body count just to prove a point. He could send a message written in red, or he could do something way more devastating. He could strike at their soul. He looks at the shattered remains of the army that used to run the whole show in Greece. They are surrounded. They are spent. They are waiting for the hammer to drop. And instead of finishing them off, he decides to let them walk. He lets them live with the nightmare of what just happened. In this next chapter, we are going to break down how Epaminondas turned a victory into a psychological weapon that kept cutting deep long after the last spear was pulled out of the mud. He forced Sparta to publicly count its dead, to beg for their bodies back, and to watch the laws and identity that held them up for centuries crack apart under the weight of one single afternoon at Leuctra. The Spartans still breathing at Leuctra are trapped. They scan the battlefield and see Theban spear points closing in from 3 different angles, like a vice grip. Behind them, the ground is literally carpeted with bodies. Most of those fallen soldiers are wearing the same crimson cloaks they are. Their king is somewhere in that pile. By every rule in the book of Greek warfare, this is the moment where the winners tighten the noose, lower the boom, and finish the job. No mercy, no survivors. But that is not the play Epaminondas is running. He does something much crueler. He hits the pause button. A Theban trumpet cuts through the chaos. The front lines stop moving. The screaming fades down to just the moaning of the wounded. The Spartans brace for the knockout punch, but it never comes. Instead, one lone figure steps out with a white flag. The terms are simple, but they are brutal. If the Spartans want their boys back, they have to open their mouths and ask for them. In the Greek world, understand this, that is not just a technicality. It is a verdict. It is an admission. There is an unwritten law on the battlefield in this civilization. If you hold the ground when the clock runs out, you won. The army that sends a messenger to ask for permission to pick up their dead has publicly and permanently admitted they got beat. That single act, walking across the field to ask, is a formal declaration of total loss. Until this afternoon, Sparta was always the one sitting on the throne, granting that request, never the one on their knees making it. Inside the Spartan camp, the decision is tearing them apart. Their king is lying out there baking in the sun. Hundreds of their best citizens are rotting on enemy soil. Leaving them unburied would violate every sacred tradition they have. But sending a guy to beg the Theban general for permission means saying out loud in front of the whole world that Sparta got broken in the open field. They have zero options left. A Spartan envoy starts that long walk across the blood-soaked ground toward the Theban lines. You can feel the weight of every set of eyes on him. Theban soldiers beat up, but victorious, are lining the path. They are watching the living representative of a shattered legend walk into their house to ask for mercy. Epaminondas is waiting, cool, calm and collected, flanked by officers who spent their whole lives terrified of the very nation this man represents. The messenger delivers the request, a truce to get the bodies, but Epaminondas catches the fine print. The way they phrased it, according to the history books, was deliberately vague. The Spartans try to frame the request as coming from the allied coalition, as a group, not from Sparta specifically. It is a desperate hustle to dilute the shame. They want to spread the loss across everybody instead of owning it. Epaminondas is not having it. He rejects the offer. He makes them say it correctly. He makes them ask as Sparta. Only when the herald states plainly that Sparta itself is requesting the truce does Epaminondas give the green light. The record is now official. Thebes has defeated Sparta. Not just in a fistfight, but in the ceremony, in the protocol, in the formal language that every city in Greece is going to be repeating for the rest of the century. And the humiliation is just getting started. Under the terms of the deal, Spartan and allied soldiers move onto the field to collect their dead. Theban troops just stand back and watch the show. What Epaminondas orchestrates next transforms a grim task into a deliberate act of psychological deconstruction. He orders the bodies to be sorted out, Spartans on one side, allies on the other. On one section of the field, the corpses of full Spartan citizens are laid out in rows. On another section, you have the bodies of the allied soldiers from the cities that were foolish enough to follow Sparta into this mess. By forcing this separation, Epaminondas turns the battlefield into an open ledger. He is doing a public audit of exactly how much Spartan blood was spilled on that dirt. And when you look at the numbers, it is catastrophic. Ancient sources tell us that out of roughly 700 Spartan citizens who marched to Leuctra, about 400 are dead. In any other city, that would be a bad day. In Sparta, with its tiny exclusive population, that is an extinction-level event. The entire Spartan pyramid scheme rests on a small core of elite warriors, supported by a massive base of slaves. That core just lost more than half its strength in one single afternoon. Epaminondas ensures that nobody can look away from the math. The allied soldiers see the sorted piles. The Boeotian troops see them. Neutral observers and travelers who are going to carry this news to every corner of Greece see them. They do not just hear a rumor that Sparta took an L. They see with their own eyes the receipts of the destruction. The city that was supposed to be untouchable suddenly looks hollow. It looks fragile. It looks finished. This is the audit of death. For 300 years, Sparta ran the game on fear. Fear of their training, fear of their record, fear of their absolute refusal to show weakness. Epaminondas found a way to turn Sparta's own dead bodies into the most powerful argument against their mythology. When these numbers hit the wire and travel across Greece, they are going to do more damage than 10 years of losing small skirmishes. As the Spartans carry their fallen brothers off the field, the Thebans put up a monument. They build a stone trophy near the battle site. It is not just a memorial for the dead. It is a permanent billboard that announces to every traveler who passes by until the end of time, this is the spot where the Spartan Empire was broken. Every year, every decade, every century, people are going to walk past this spot and remember the truth. The cruelty goes even deeper when the news finally reaches Sparta. The city is in the middle of a holy festival when the messenger runs in. The rituals are happening. The choirs are singing. In any other Greek city, news of a disaster this big would shut the party down instantly. People would run out of the church. They would rip their clothes. They would fill the streets with screaming and crying. But Sparta is not any other city. When the intel finally hits the desk of the ephors, the shadow rulers running things from behind the curtain, they don't panic publicly. They bury it. They refuse to let the optics of the festival be ruined by reality. They absorb the hit behind closed doors like a true deep state operation. The king has been taken off the board. Hundreds of their citizens have been wiped out. The so-called invincible army has been decimated in open combat. The narrative is collapsing. Then they issue a decree that exposes just how demonic and twisted the indoctrination of the Spartan system truly is. The order is absolute: no public mourning. You are not allowed to grieve. You have to understand the programming here. Spartan custom dictates that showing grief for men killed in battle is forbidden. It's a complete inversion of human nature. A son who dies fighting for the state is supposed to be a trophy, a source of pride, not sorrow. The only families given permission to wail in the streets are the ones whose sons made it back home alive in disgrace. After the slaughter at Leuctra, this rule turns the whole city into a theater of the absurd, a twisted reality where life is shame and death is glory. Visualize the scene unfolding. The news spreads like a virus from household to household. Mothers are getting the word that their bloodlines are cut off. Wives are realizing they are now widows and their husbands are never walking through that door again. Every God-given instinct in their bodies is screaming at them to break down, to holler, to rip their clothes in agony. But the law of the state stands over them, cold and immovable like a stone idol. The system demands they step out in public with stone-cold faces, even looking satisfied, just to prove the lie that Sparta is unbroken. Historians and ancient writers look back at this and describe a scene that borders on the surreal. It's like something out of a psychological horror movie. You see the mothers of the men who fell at Leuctra walking out of their homes with their spines stiff and eyes dry. Some of them are displaying this grim, brainwashed pride. Their sons held the line. Their sons didn't run. They sacrificed their children to the machine. That is supposed to be the correct response in this culture. Meanwhile, the mothers of the survivors, the ones whose boys are still breathing, are walking around with their heads hanging low. They cover their faces in humiliation. They are the ones carrying the visible mark of shame. Their sons came back alive from a battle that Sparta lost. If there is even a whisper, a shadow of a doubt about their courage, the entire family absorbs that disgrace. They call it resilience, but I call it a sickness. This is a society that is cannibalizing itself. Behind closed doors, away from the prying eyes of the secret police, the reality must be unbearable. Parents who want to mourn are gagged. Wives who want to scream at the generals who led their husbands into a trap have to swallow every single word. The entire city is commanded to perform a massive lie, acting out a fiction that this disaster somehow validates their values instead of exposing the high cost of their arrogance. But in the quiet spaces, in the whispered conversations where they think no one is listening, the mask is starting to crack. People are waking up. They are beginning to ask the dangerous question: is this system, which we have sacrificed everything to uphold, actually worth the blood it demands? For the men who survived the meat grinder of Leuctra, coming home is its own kind of living hell. Sparta has a special classification for those who display fear or self-preservation in battle tresantes. The tremblers. To be branded a trembler is to be a dead man walking. You are effectively cancelled. You lose your citizenship. You are forced to wear a patchwork cloak that advertises your disgrace to everyone you pass on the street. It gets more humiliating. You may be compelled to shave off only half of your beard in a degrading pattern, so everyone knows you're broken. Anyone can walk up and insult you, slap you, or mock you in public, and there is zero consequence. You become a walking monument to cowardice, a living warning sign of what Sparta does to those who break rank. After Leuctra, The list of potential tremblers is longer than it has ever been in their history. And let's be real, not every survivor was a coward. Many of these guys fought with everything they had and simply drew the luck of not getting killed. But in the chaos of a collapsing phalanx, when the fog of war sets in, no one can verify every individual action. The rumor mill moves faster than the truth ever could. This man was seen turning his back. That one was spotted without his shield. He was in the wrong spot when the line broke. Accusations fly like arrows. In a system as rigid and legalistic as Sparta, context is irrelevant. The law doesn't ask why, it only asks what happened. But now Sparta is staring down a paradox that threatens to destroy it from the inside out. The body count is so high that the city literally cannot afford to cancel the survivors. The military-industrial complex that defines Spartan identity depends on maintaining a critical mass of trained killers. With hundreds of its best elite warriors rotting in the soil of Boeotia, the army is dangerously depleted. The ranks are empty. If they apply the strict law of the Tremblers to every man whose behavior at Leuctra can be questioned, they will cripple their own fighting strength for a generation or more. This is where the defeat reaches past the battlefield and wraps its fingers around the throat of the Spartan identity itself, their laws. King Agesilaus, the elder statesman and power broker, who wasn't at Leuctra but still pulls the strings, is confronting an impossible dilemma. The ancient code says the law is absolute. A coward is cast out permanently. No exceptions, no appeals court. But the new arithmetic is brutal, and it doesn't care about tradition. Sparta needs living bodies that know how to hold a spear. The world has just learned in the most public way imaginable that Spartan manpower is not infinite. So Agesilaus does something that previous generations of hardliners would have considered straight-up sacrilege. He bends the unbendable law. Later writers describe a moment where the ironclad rule against rehabilitating men judged as cowards is quietly suspended. Some sources characterize it with a phrase that cuts to the bone: for one day the laws of Lycurgus would sleep. The city reclassifies some of its survivors. It moves the goalposts. It adjusts its own categories to find ways to reabsorb men it would once have permanently destroyed. That phrase, "the laws would sleep," matters more than any battle casualty. It is a public confession that the system is no longer untouchable. The idol has feet of clay. For centuries, Sparta told Greece and told itself that its laws were perfect, eternal, handed down by a semi-divine lawgiver and never to be altered under any circumstances. Now, under the pressure of a single defeat, those laws bend. And if they can bend once the entire foundation cracks, if the code of Lycurgus can be suspended when it becomes inconvenient for the elites, then it was never divine. It was just a rule enforced by men and breakable by men. The curtain is pulled back. Epaminondas has not merely killed Spartans, he has forced them to betray the story they tell about themselves. You could close the book right here and Leuctra would already rank among the most devastating reality checks in ancient history. A king dead. A citizen army gutted, sacred laws twisted like pretzels to cover the wound. But Epaminondas, he is not finished yet. He understands something that separates true strategic vision from simple battlefield brilliance. He knows Sparta's real power was never just its hoplites. It was the invisible infrastructure underneath them, the helots. For centuries, the Spartans had maintained their warrior lifestyle by ruling over an enormous population of enslaved laborers, concentrated especially in Messenia, the rich agricultural region to the west. These helots were the ones who worked the fields, harvested the grain, and produced the surplus wealth. They were the engine that allowed Spartan citizens to spend their entire lives training for war instead of farming for food. They were systematically brutalized, humiliated, treated like animals. They were terrorized by a secret police apparatus designed to crush any hint of rebellion before it could organize. Everyone in Greece understood the truth. If the helots ever revolted in large enough numbers, Sparta would face an existential crisis. Now imagine being a helot in the weeks and months after the crash of Leuctra. You hear the whispers that the undefeatable Spartan army was broken by Thebans. You hear that the king himself was killed on the field. You hear that entire units of Spartan citizens never came home. The terror that has kept you obedient for your entire life, that kept your parents obedient, that kept your grandparents obedient, it is beginning to dissolve. If someone powerful enough arrives to shatter your chains, are you going to fight them off, or are you going to rise up? Epaminondas sees the opening and he drives straight through it. In the years following Leuctra, he leads Theban-led coalition armies deep into the Peloponnese, right into the Spartan homeland. In 370 and 369 BC, he accomplishes something that no hostile force had managed in recorded Greek history. He marches into Laconia itself. For centuries, Sparta had kept every enemy army at a distance. The terrain, the military reputation, and the sheer psychological weight of the Spartan name had formed an invisible barrier that no invader dared to cross. But that wall has fallen. That old barrier, it's gone. Vaporized. For the first time in history, the so-called untouchable elite of Sparta are standing on their porches, looking out at a landscape that doesn't belong to them anymore. They are watching the campfires of their enemies burning bright in their own backyard. The smoke rising from those burning villages is a signal, a divine smoke signal telling them their time is up. You have to understand, these fields had never felt the boot of a foreign invader. Not once. Now they are getting trampled into the dirt by Theban soldiers who aren't afraid of the boogeyman anymore. The Spartans are forced onto their back foot for the first time in their collective memory. They are retreating, pulled back to try and save their own mansions instead of marching out to conquer the world. The hunter has become the hunted. That carefully crafted image of Sparta as this impenetrable fortress, this beast that no danger could ever touch, extinguished. Snuffed out like a candle in a hurricane. But here is the thing about Epaminondas. He isn't just satisfied with kicking in the front door. He isn't content with a simple invasion. He wants to tear the whole corrupt system down to the studs. He goes straight for the root of the tree. He marches his forces down to Messenia. Up on Mount Ithome and all the surrounding holy sites, he starts doing something radical. He helps the Messenian population. People who had lived as helots, as slaves, under the brutal thumb of Spartan domination for generations, he helps them build something new. He helps them construct a fortified city of their own Messene. This is nation building 101. He is gathering the exiles, the outcasts, the rebels who had been scattered to the winds. He gives them military backing, hands them swords and shields, and declares their independence. He tells them, you are not slaves anymore. You are kings and queens of your own land. It is a complete reversal of the social order. The helots of Messenia are no longer listed as Spartan property on some ledger. They are free citizens of a brand new state, protected by walls thick enough to laugh at a siege and backed by alliances strong enough to make any Spartan think twice about trying to take them back. This is the breaking of chains in real time. Listen to me, this is not just symbolism. This isn't just a photo op. This is economic annihilation. By liberating Messenia, Epaminondas is ripping out the agricultural and labor foundation that has sustained the Spartan way of life for centuries. He is cutting off the money supply. He is destroying the very engine that kept the elite fat and happy while the people suffered. The fields that grew the grain to feed the Spartiate households. Those fields are feeding a different people now. The forced labor, the free work that allowed Spartan citizens to train full-time for war while everyone else did the heavy lifting, that is gone. The free ride is over. The gravy train has officially derailed. Without their helot workforce, the Spartans can no longer maintain that luxury lifestyle that produced their warriors. They have to pick up a hoe and work their own land for the first time in forever. The curse of oppression has circled back around. If they want to eat, they have to sweat. They are forced to adjust to a new world order where resources are finite and leisure is no longer guaranteed by the suffering of others. They become poorer. They become weaker. The judgment has been set and the decline accelerates with every passing year. We are watching the slow-motion car crash of an empire. And he doesn't stop there. He performs a similar surgical operation in Arcadia, helping to establish the fortified city of Megalopolis as a permanent counterweight to Spartan influence in the central Peloponnese. He is building altars of freedom right next to their temples of oppression. Everywhere Epaminondas moves, he is not simply winning skirmishes or battles. He is redrawing the political map of Greece in ways designed to ensure that Spartan dominance can never ever reconstitute itself. He is putting safeguards in place to make sure the beast stays in the pit. This is the architecture of total humiliation. It is a masterclass in dismantling a bully. First, you shatter their army in open combat so everyone sees they bleed. Then, you force the defeated to formally acknowledge their loss in the ritual language of Greek warfare. You make them say it out loud. Enough pressure to make their sacred, supposedly eternal laws bend and break. You expose their traditions as nothing more than man-made rules designed to control you. And finally, the finishing move, you march into their homeland and liberate the enslaved population whose labor made the entire Spartan system possible. You take away their power source. After all of this, Sparta still exists on the map. The city is not razed to the ground. Its temples still stand there. Its name still carries a fading echo of the old terror, like a ghost story people tell at night. But the substance beneath the name is gone. The spirit has left the building. Sparta will never again be the undisputed military hegemon of Greece. It will linger on as a shadow of what it was trading on a reputation that the rest of the world now knows is hollow. It is a zombie state. And what becomes of Epaminondas, the man who swung the hammer? He does not build a personal empire. He does not declare himself king or tyrant. He doesn't let the power go to his head. He remains what he has always been, a citizen general of Thebes. He is called to command when the city needs him, and he returns to ordinary life when the campaign ends. He is a servant of the cause, not a master of the people. In the year 362 BC, at the Battle of Mantinea, he leads another coalition against a combined force that includes Spartans and their new partners. It is the final showdown. The forces of the new era against the remnants of the old guard. Once again, he wins. Once again, his tactics prove superior. He outsmarts them at every turn. But this time, victory takes everything from him. During the heavy fighting, a spear strikes him in the chest and lodges deep right near his heart. His men carry him from the field, panic in their eyes. The surgeons examine the wound and deliver the verdict he already knows in his spirit. The spearhead is buried too deep. It's fatal. Removing it will almost certainly kill him instantly. Leaving it in will kill him slowly. Epaminondas, fully aware of what is happening, asks one question. He doesn't ask about his money or his fame. He asks, "Did we win?" When they tell him the enemy is in retreat, he looks at them and tells them to pull the spear out. He dies shortly after. Ancient writers record that someone told him in his final moments that it was a tragedy he had no sons to continue his name. No male heir to carry the torch. His supposed answer has echoed through 24 centuries of history. He said he was leaving behind 2 daughters, Leuctra and Mantinea. His battles were his children, his victories were his lineage. Whether or not those exact words left his lips, the meaning is unmistakable. His legacy is not a bloodline. It is a revolution in how wars are fought and how myths are destroyed. Thebes itself will not hold the summit for long, but the shift has happened. Within a generation, a new force will rise from the north. Philip II of Macedon, who spent part of his youth as a hostage in Thebes watching the master at work, will study the innovations Epaminondas pioneered. He will absorb them and refine them further with longer spears and heavier cavalry. His son Alexander will carry that evolved system across 3 continents and reshape the known world. The prophecy of change continues to unfold, moving from one vessel to the next. But none of that erases what happened on a dusty plain in Boeotia in the year 371 BC. One man looked at the most feared military machine in the Greek world, the system everyone said was invincible, and he refused to accept the story it told about itself. He saw through the illusion. He treated Sparta not as a godlike force, but as a system built by humans. He saw formations that could be outmaneuvered, laws that could be pressured, rituals that could be exploited, and myths that could be killed. He realized the gods of his age were just men in fancy armor. Then he went after every single one of those components systematically without mercy until nothing was left but the name. He took the machine apart gear by gear. He did not just defeat Sparta. He measured it, exposed it, humiliated it, and then dismantled the foundations that had made its power possible in the first place. He showed the world that the emperor had no clothes. Epaminondas proved that the deadliest weapon on any battlefield is not a sharper spear or a thicker shield. It is a superior idea. It is a mindset executed without hesitation, aimed directly at the story your enemy believes about who they are. Once you break their belief, you break their power. History is filled with moments like this, sudden collapses where a power everyone assumed was invincible is dragged down in a single shocking reversal. We are seeing these patterns repeat even today. The bigger they are, the harder they fall. So, here is where I want to hear from you. We are in 2026 now, and we are seeing history rhyme. Which military defeat do you think was even more humiliating than what Sparta suffered at Leuctra? I need you to head to the pinned comment right now. I have left a question there designed to change how we think about ancient warfare and modern power dynamics. Drop your answer, argue your case, and see what others are saying. Let's fight this one out in the comments section. I want to see your truth. Thank you for staying with this story until the very end. If you felt that shift in your chest when the Spartan myth cracked open, if you felt that spirit of liberation, make sure you subscribe, hit the like button, and share this video with someone who still believes that any power in history was truly untouchable. Wake them up. On your screen, right now, there is a new episode waiting for you. Click it and keep going. Feed your mind. Do not stop here. If you want to understand how dark, brutal, and strange our past really was, and how it connects to the now, that video is your mandatory next chapter. You have just watched another premium documentary by this channel. Stay sharp, stay awake, peace.